Swaran Singh from the School of International Studies at JNU. Thank you very much, Professor, for being with us. So we've been talking, as we know, about China and the East Asia Summit process. Has ASEAN-China dialogue sort of changed after this East Asia process started, where ASEAN started dialoguing with 6 partners, then 8. Now it's become a large process. And how has it affected China's relationship in this grouping?
I think, Mark, clearly the expansion of ASEAN into East Asia Summit does help ASEAN countries because they have not been able to themselves collectively stand against China. China deals with ASEAN countries mostly in bilateral platforms. They have had one declaration on conduct in South China Sea, which sometimes there are questions whether it is being implemented in both in terms of word and spirit. And they've also been negotiating something called Code of Conduct in South China Sea way back from 2002, formal negotiations from 2017, which is still to conclude in that sense. So the pace of collective ASEAN standing up to China has been really lukewarm, to put it politely. And in that sense, it is useful for ASEAN to have a much larger gathering of East Asian nations, 18 nations. And all 17 are definitely concerned with the way this unprecedented rise of China has resulted in kind of showcasing power projections. And I think most interesting, hopefully from the summit today, will be the speech from Ferdinand Marcos, the president of Philippines, who did mention very strongly his concerns of China's behavior in South China Sea, in both in China ASEAN Summit and also in India ASEAN Summit. So whether he is going to take that forward to East Asia Summit as well, so that could be an area of definitely concern, which will perhaps will not confine itself to indirect references of China, but make a direct mention of China, of course. And clearly United States is another country that is always concerned with China's expansion. In fact, 2018 Indo-Pacific strategy document of United States under President Trump had clearly mentioned that China doesn't only have intentions, it has today capacity to replace United States in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, and therefore concerned to bring partnerships with like-minded nations in the region and ensure free and open Indo-Pacific as the acronym has been since then. So I think China definitely is a concern for all 17, and of course they will not make direct mention of this. But the big elephant in the room will be definitely China, but there are going to be a lot of other issues. Myanmar will be definitely another major issue because for about 2+ years there is a 5-point program consensus of ASEAN which has not moved any further. So nations would be willing to know where it is going. Indian Prime Minister, I am expecting to definitely make mention of issue of terrorism, but of course also make positive proposals for the whole context of resilience and connectivity. So health resilience, cyber security resilience, connectivity resilience, and of course disaster resilience and so on. Connectivity is another major area. I think there are a large number of countries which now have direct flights. I think if you add Brunei, then 8 of the 10. We are opening embassy in let's say also in East Timor as well, and that is also going to be added to connectivity. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch what Indian Prime Minister is planning to bring to the table today. And more nations are getting excited to engage India because India is 8% growth rate is really attractive.
Yes.
And India is now expected to become third largest earlier than 2030. So very different expectations, and therefore I think very different possibilities of what India is going to bring to the table.
Professor, a supplementary question to what you were saying. You said that the ASEAN's response to China's belligerence has been lukewarm, perhaps because the word China hasn't been mentioned even in yesterday's joint statement of the India-ASEAN summit. And now we'll see what the chairman's summary has to say in the East Asia summit. But that's still, would you say, some voice against what we see in terms of bilateral meetings between China and various countries? Because, for instance, Brunei Darussalam has been a silent claimant to its maritime claims in the South China Sea. But when the Prime Minister went there in the joint statement, there were references to freedom of navigation, overflight, on clause, etc. So, would you say that ASEAN still is a platform where most of these countries have a voice, and East Asia Summit is one wherein China is also a member state. So they're treading cautiously, but the spirit is the same. And the only exception perhaps is Mr. Marcos,
Yes.
who has bluntly put the challenge that China poses to Philippines' maritime claims.
Absolutely. Two things. One, most of multilateral meetings end up being collation of bilaterals. So therefore, what happens on the sidelines is often more interesting than what happens on the formal discussions. Second, I think it's also important to note what is done and said in indirect fashion, because nations do not want to really annoy each other because they have to work together. Except Marcos' speech, as you mentioned, which is of course expected because he's been pushed to the wall for almost 2 years now. And therefore, what is going to happen in indirect mentions, India-ASEAN summit you saw made mention of need to ensure that the declaration of conduct in South China Sea is implemented to the word and spirit, and also for early conclusion of code of conduct in South China Sea, which is originally started in 2002, but formal negotiation from 2017. So India has also likewise with ASEAN indirectly made mention of things that clearly indicate to expectations being different from China. And of course, Indian Foreign Minister, when he was in Manila, made a clear mention India stands with the Philippines in terms of ensuring their safety, security, sovereignty.
And they also agreed with the 2016 Court of Arbitration ruling belatedly.
Indeed. So India has over a period of time become more assertive.
Yeah.
It's being more assertive in terms of what India stands for. So there are occasionally, for example, way back in 2015, the joint statement with President Obama had said that we want to ensure peace and security and sovereignty in South China Sea. Beijing didn't like it at that time. So India increasingly is becoming assertive, but also driven by leverages that India now has because of growing economic heft in that sense. So ASEAN nations from 1990s, when India started engaging them, had looked at India as a countervailing power to China. Only India wasn't willing to be, playing that role. Even India today also says we don't have to be either bandwagoning anyone or appearing to be as an alternative to anyone. India is too large to fit into those kind of templates. India stands for itself. India stands for what we want to contribute to our own peace and security and prosperity, and by extension, prosperity of the rest of the region and world. In that
One
sense.
more supplementary, if you allow me, is whether you think there is any likelihood of other member states taking inspiration from Marcos's direct approach towards China, or will they continue to be more cagey and cautious? Maybe because we must acknowledge here that Philippines is a treaty partner of the United States. There's a missile system that the United States has deployed for Philippines, which may not be the case with other members of ASEAN or East Asia Summit, barring, of course, China. So, do you think others could go in that direction, or will they continue to be cautious?
Since no other ASEAN country has faced what Philippines has in terms of, crashing into each other's vessels and so on. So the tone of President Ferdinand Marcos will definitely be different, and may
Japan
not be,
also has been quite upfront
yes,
in the
but we have a new
East
Prime
Asia
Minister from
Summit,
Japan
yes,
now,
yeah.
so he's going to wait and watch things before he really takes on that kind of harsh tone in such meetings. I think Thailand could be another example. Thailand is showing interest to join BRICS in that sense. So it's member of ASEAN. It's a treaty partner also with the United States in that sense. So I don't think that tone is likely to be matched. In fact, even the President Marcos may tone down his speech in the East Asian Summit. But the anxiety, I think, is definitely shared by several of these nations. And I think in bilaterals, some of these things will definitely come out.
Do we still have Ambassador?
Particularly South China Sea.
Professor Swaran Singh is still with us. Professor Swaran Singh, apart from of all these 18 countries, Russia is also part of the East Asia Summit process. Not much is being talked about them. What do you think? I mean, with some of the issues that Russia has, I mean, the fact that there are sanctions against them, the fact that there is this military operation in Ukraine going on for indefinitely, all these, could they be raised?
I think first of all, given that 2.5 years plus Ukraine conflict has resulted in stringent sanctions from West on Russia, but also attempt to isolate Russia. And in that sense, this becomes a very significant platform for Russia to be present and visible in global multilateral forums. So, seasoned foreign minister Sergei Lavrov is there now in Vientiane, and he's going to raise his own concerns. Of course, I hope issue of Ukraine is not brought in, because this is not the region that that want to prioritize a disruptive issue like Ukraine, but it could still come up indirectly. Lavrov may have something to say about it. But more interesting, I think it is also to see that this year Russia also is holding the chair of BRICS nations, and this month actually, is going to be BRICS summit as well. So he is also there to gauge the kind of responses that he's going to get in his bilaterals with a series of leaders of these 17 other countries at East Asia Summit meeting, to see how and what kind of consensus they can achieve in the BRICS summit as well, because members of BRICS are also here. Members of Quad are also in that sense there, and so in that sense he will also be careful in gauging how the Quad is looking at collectively on issue of Ukraine crisis. India, as you know, lately, Mark, has been far more active in, at least shall we say, accelerating the process of peace talks becoming a possibility. So I think Lavrov will also have a conversation with the Indian delegation. At what level that happens, we don't know. So the Russian presence in East Asia Summit, of which India has always been a great supporter. India has always maintained Russia is as much resident power of Indo-Pacific region as any other country is. So in that sense, I think there is also going to be certain conversation between India and Foreign Minister Lavrov. India is going to be Prime Minister, hopefully is going to the BRICS summit soon. So in that sense, I think Russia's going to take this as an opportunity to be in East Asia Summit with 18 other nations. Indeed, we all remember also how for about 10 years, India is a founding member of East Asia Summit, but both United States and Russia were not allowed to enter despite their, showing interest publicly for about 10 years. 2015 is when Russia and United States came into East Asia Summit meeting. So I think for Russia and for Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, this is clearly an opportunity on eve of BRICS Summit to gauge the mood and of course showcase Russian presence in a major multilateral forum.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Let's take.
What about the relationship, Professor Swan Singh, between Russia and China? Because I mean, it looks like much is being done to sort of contain the belligerence of China as an expansionist power, and Russia, is at the current time at least, looking to lean on China for other reasons.
I remember we were mentioning 17 plus 1 and you in the break were mentioning 16 plus 2.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually better formulation, that it could actually be 16 plus 2, given the fact that February 2022 they had agreed on a joint statement talking about no limits relationship, which has rattled much of the Western world in that sense. So yes, indeed, even in East Asia Summit, you could actually think of 16 plus 2, China and Russia being together in this, and both of them being concerned for the rest of the 16. In fact, definitely to several of the rest of the 16, both Russia and China are in that sense concerned. But because we are focusing here on Indo-Pacific, definitely concern will be much more on China's way of becoming increasingly assertive, particularly in South China Sea. And India is a direct, recipient of that kind of assertive tone and aggressive tone. We have had tensions on the border. India has stood up to, of course, China in all these last 4 years, and the entire neighborhood and world has noticed that India has stood up to China during this period, and therefore you see it's maybe piecemeal but gradual process of finding a kind of reconciliation and going back to what we are saying February 2020 positions on border between India and China. So India definitely also has its own concerns to ensure that India participates in that exercise where effort is fundamentally not very coercive. It's simply the international community expects China to simply follow rules, regulations, norms, conventions, treaties that are built over a period of time. And of course, India stands with China on saying, yes, we need to reform international governance institutions. But then the institutions, norms, rules, regulations that have
But
evolved.
China wouldn't want India to be a permanent member of the UN.
That's of
at
course
the
an
same
ongoing
time.
story, yes.
Yes, so let's take this forward.
Professor Swaran Singh, the ASEAN already is I mean, they have various dialogues, including a defense ministers dialogue. You can look at this East Asia summit also because of the security aspect, assuming a certain defense dialogue component over time. And if Japan's prime minister seems to have an idea of a nation NATO, I mean, this is the place to start in ASEAN and move around. He already may have the support of the ROK. And because they're all, they all have a definite interest in protecting the sea lanes and China. From
Also,
China.
if I may add, Japan is giving up on its pacifism as well.
That
So
is
in that context too.
That is absolutely true, but as Ambassador Tayal brought out so beautifully, even if there is a strong sense of need of more teeth in responding to China's behavior, civilizationally this part of the world is not comfortable with military alliances. He did mention how just like NATO was created for North Atlantic, United States after Second World War had created CETO and CENTO here, which did not really survive, and they were never disbanded, but they just became dysfunctional over a period of time, and that is where ASEAN became an important entity, and even today every major nation continues to provide lip service to see ASEAN on the driving seat in that sense in regional dialogues. Yes, there is desirability, but perhaps not feasibility of creating that kind of military alliance driven regional arrangement. Yes, during President Trump's period, particularly the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, you remember his speeches were very harsh. In fact, foreign ministers meeting in Delhi had to issue separate 4 statements, not a single joint statement, because tone was very different. He used to talk about Chinese people and party being different entities. India's policy on that subject has been absolutely clear and clarified repeatedly, starting with 2018 June 1st speech of Prime Minister in Shangri-La dialogue, then of course 2022 August speech of Foreign Minister Jaishankar in Chulalongkorn University. India has made it clear India would not like to see the region militarized, and that is where ultimately President Joe Biden in September 2021 had to create AUKUS. Because wherever India is in Quad, India talks of Quad plus, which is welcome. Other countries are welcome to join. Should not be exclusive club, should not be militarized. So if you look at Quad, at best, the farthest it goes is to look at non-traditional security. Piracy, cyber security and so on, not military security in that sense. And ASEAN, which is at the center, is simply from initial focus of United States to sort of controlling spread of communism to then counterbalancing, soft balancing of China. But from late 1990s, from East Asian financial crisis, when China was the first country to jump in and come for their help, because by now China was also having economic heft, changed the equations between ASEAN. ASEAN no longer remained as a sort of countervailing, counterbalancing, soft balancing regional body for China. Today, China has nearly about $700 billion of trade. If you want to compare with India's $130 billion, China has enormous economic relationship with ASEAN. That is why United States chose to create something else called Quad, where major regional stakeholders, Australia, Japan, India, and United States, think they can perhaps create situations such that some restraint on China's behavior can be still brought to bear, But because India is the only country in that four-country group which is not alliance partner and is committed not to militarize the region, I don't see that as a possibility. But we are again saying President Trump might return to White House. Maybe Secretary of State Mike Pompeo might return to State Department. We could see that tone coming back, and how India will handle that situation, I think it will be interesting to watch.
Yes. Now,
India has constantly used soft power, it appears. And now we are amongst the great powers, going to be there. I mean, soon going to be the third largest economy in the world. And the great powers seem to use hard power a lot. So, I mean, is this a problem that India would have moving forward? Because even in the initiatives that we sort of start, it's voluntary to join these sort of things, rather than some sort of method where people are attracted to join for the benefit that India would be in a position to provide that kind of security blanket.
I think, Mark, there is no doubt that major powers are able to bring in any transformation in global governance primarily driven by hard power. I agree with you. Very often they prefer not to use hard power, and soft power actually becomes effective if in the backdrop there is hard power. So that is perfectly understandable that India will also have to become much more capable in hard power, though it will keep using soft power. What is interesting is that for almost first 6 decades of India's post-independence history, largely the kind of groupings, parties that were in command of the nation were not inclined to yield power, use hard power and demonstrate hard power. They were much more inclined to use conciliation, persuasion, kind of working together, dialogue and all that. Which is not that they neglected hard power, particularly after India-China War of 1962. There was a clear focus on building hard power also, but their preference was not hard power at heart. And the ruling party, which is now in power for 10 plus years, it's not now. From the beginning itself, you remember Yansang used to talk about nuclear weapons from 1960s, even before 1960s. So now the country is in command of the kind of groupings and political power and people who have no qualms in using hard power and wielding hard power, showcasing hard power. Of course, preference again is first to use soft power. So I agree with you that kind of India has changed, world has changed, and now we have a party in command which is not shy of using hard power when it is required, even if preference, of course, remains dialogue, diplomacy, soft power, and so on. What is interesting, and as Ambassador Tayal was also mentioning, when you look at all different major powers that we are discussing have now got focused on Indo-Pacific region, have issued their strategy and report papers and so on. United States and Canada, Germany, Britain, France, so many have issued their strategy papers on how they want to engage Indo-Pacific. That is where India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative comes in as a document, other than 2 speeches that I mentioned, which outline what India thinks. And IPOI brings in what India can bring into the table in delivering leadership in that sense. And because India's vision on Indo-Pacific is closest to ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, that is where in the same summit meeting in 2019, the two had also signed a joint statement saying we want to now develop further cooperation between IPOI and AOIP. And that is where I think what is interesting, what India is bringing to the table is new and novel, because you hear Indian Foreign Minister repeatedly talking about plurilateralism, which is different from multipolarism, minilateralism, multilateralism and so on. Plurilateralism is a conception where you want to create an overarching big themes and have large number of members agreeing to participate in that, but have flexibility of creating small silos. And so it has 6 silos in that sense of focused areas where the membership could be fluid. Not all members of the larger collective have to be member of each of these silos. So examples of International Solar Alliance, examples of Global Coalition of Biofuels, and now this IPOI is an example which is flexibility and fluidity, where members can sort of keep shifting from one focus area to another focus area, and they could make sure they make best contributions in the focus area where they are coming as a collective, as a smaller group. And since you mentioned whether new members could come in, to me that's not a very serious issue. Members can come in and exit anytime. It's a much more flexible arrangement of plurilateralism, where you want to focus on what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve and what are going to be your partners in moving forward. So in every case, you have a larger vision of Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which is where we want to talk about, as I said, already 6 specific areas focused on area, maritime security, cyber security, same issues are there also. But membership of the larger collective and of the subgroups can be flexible in that sense. So yes,
Prime Minister said, particularly in the context of the situation in South China Sea?
I think first thing to note is that if Indian Prime Minister is listed to be among the early speakers in the morning, I think maybe soon after the host,
Yes.
is a reflection of India's credibility and acceptability in the entire region, which is a good news. Second, I think the Prime Minister began with the mention of Typhoon Yagi. Wants to front load that as a main concern, and India's diplomacy, India's naval exercises have lately for about 15 years very focused on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. That has become a kind of important priority for India's foreign policy, which makes India also the first responder very often in most crises. So that was definitely pegged and flagged as first important issue of focus for Indian Prime Minister. He did mention several things that perhaps allude to China's behavior. He mentioned expansionism, which go back to his September 2015 speech from Japan. That issue of expansionism has always been part of his speeches. Whether we should be focusing on partnerships or expansion. The third important area, I think specifically as you asked me, is on South China Sea. Whether it was in yesterday's India-ASEAN summit or it is today in his speech to the East Asia Summit meeting, the need to be free and fair and follow rules and regulations as outlined under United Nations Convention on Law of Seas, clearly has a kind of a hint towards what is happening in South China Sea in that sense. And more specifically, I understand he made mention of peace, security and stability being India's concern in South China Sea, which is, I think, going a step forward compared to the formulations that India has had so far. And that should be seen in backdrop of India lately being much more assertive in India-Philippines relationships. Indian Foreign Minister in Manila making a clear mention of India standing by Philippines' right to assert its sovereignty, protect its security, and of course the whole sort of military cooperation, defense cooperation that India-Philippines has, India-Vietnam has, which sometimes Chinese are not most comfortable with India's rising heft in that region. But I think clearly there is a little step forward here in the speech where India is becoming much more clear, much more specific, much more assertive as to how it wants to see the region ensuring peace, stability and security and following norms and rules that exist so far. Without naming China, but it's a clear reference to concerns of India vis-a-vis China's behavior in the region, which, as I keep saying, is a concern of not just India, but definitely of 15 other countries, if not 16, out of the 18 countries that are in conversation today in Vientiane, in Laos capital, as part of East Asia Summit, which is, I think, most powerful, most influential, potentially most game-changing summit meeting for Indo-Pacific region,
Yes.
in which India's visibility and credibility has constantly transformed over years.
Yes, we are getting more information.